Happy Friday, everyone. It's the Friday after Thanksgiving and the second to the last episode of Drumversations, where we'll be talking about the importance of community today, kind of doing a review of some things we were talking about earlier in the summer, to wrap up real nice in a bow as we enter the Christmas season, this idea of a politics of humanity. But first, I'm wearing Diva and the Dude. We've been endeavoring to support black businesses, particularly cool shirts, because I like t-shirts. And this is a couple kids of a friend of ours who are designing these shirts and selling them. So if you dig the shirt, check out Diva and the Dude and support local to Ohio black business. And as always, before we start, we want to remember our ancestors and create some synchronicity. So we want to breathe and just kind of level set, reset, center ourselves. So breathe in, out. Breathe in and out. Breathe in all the love, joy, and peace of the universe. Out all the anxiety, craziness, fear. Breathe in love. Out crazy. As always, in an effort to remember who we are, we remember our ancestors. Put their names in the chat. I'll play the ancestral drum call and call their names afterwards. Ed Bell, Ashe. Edna Bell, Ashe.
Charles Bell,
Charles Bell, Ashe.
William Bell,
William Bell, Ashe.
George Bell,
George Bell, Ashe.
Michael Bell,
Michael Bell, Ashe.
Patricia Bell,
Patricia Bell, Ashe.
Danielle Bell,
Danielle Bell, Ashe.
Larry Baker Jr.,
Larry Baker Jr., Ashe.
William Daniel Cox,
William Daniel Cox, Ashe.
Edward William Cox Sr.,
Edward William Cox Sr., Ashe. And we say Ashe for all the ancestors that are named and unnamed, all those born and unborn, yet unborn, because it all helps us remember who we are, and it all helps guide us to a better future. So last week we talked about entering the innerverse, right? It was a recap of some of the discussions we had at the beginning of the COVID crisis, in the beginning of Drumversations, where we were focused on how do we come out of the crisis better, right? It's not, I think, enough to say we're going to come out of this and return to normal, because normal might not have been great. I honestly don't think normal was great prior to COVID. So at that time, we were thinking about COVID as a reset. And in that reset, how can we use this time to improve who we are so that the world is actually better on the other side of COVID? And part of that is connecting to the innerverse, that place inside where you find each other, right? That place inside where you find balance, that place inside where you find your most authentic self. Because if we want to change something, anything, the first thing we have to do is change ourselves. And that's the process of change, of becoming, right? And it's the first ritual in the politics of humanity, the ritual of connection to yourself, to your ancestors and the cosmos, and to the community. This is really focused on the communal aspect of that. The second ritual is the ritual of education. And part of education is not just reading or ingesting information. There's a lot that can be learned from communal engagement, right? And by communal engagement, I don't mean just gathering with a bunch of people. That's actually not safe right now, right? I mean, engaging in conversation virtually in this context, and learning from ideas that are new to you, right? We live in an era of fake news, and it's really hard for a lot of people to judge what's real and what's fake. And a lot of that is because of how social media and algorithms manipulate our news feeds and all that other kind of stuff. But also it's about our ability to hear differing perspectives and vet them for what they are, and not just reject them because we don't believe or don't agree, right? That process of engaging ideas and ideals that may or may not align with how you are currently programmed also builds that muscle of critical thinking that allows us to better vet, engage whether or not information is relevant and real. So the power of community is really important in establishing, connecting, and practicing a politics of humanity on the other side of this virus. So we want to talk about that. And you know, the first part of that is what happens when you begin that connection internally, right? We talked about what the innerverse is and all that kind of stuff. And as you begin this path of growth, you'll start to realize that change is literally happening with you, right? So at some point in the process, you'll notice, if you haven't already, that things around you start changing because your perception of those things change, right? So you might be on the internet and in chat rooms about certain things that, as you begin this process of becoming, no longer seem relevant to you. And you start looking for a different kind of conversation, right? Maybe a higher level conversation, or folks who are thinking more deeply about topics you care about. People who have been your friends might not be the same to you as they were before you started this process, because as you begin to change yourself, you're actually changing your vibrational frequency, which means you resonate differently than you did prior to that path of becoming. And so the folks around you, if they're not resonating at your frequency, there's no longer harmony and consonance. So you have to shift, even who you're hanging out with in your bubble safely. Your choices and your surroundings might also start to change because your perception of choices and surroundings change, right? You might be in environments that focus on certain behaviors, actions, activities that as you begin this process of growth no longer, again, resonate with where you're headed, right? That's part of the process. I mean, if you're a caterpillar, you're crawling on the ground and in the dirt, and that's where you find your nutrients, but you go in the chrysalis and you become a butterfly, the dirt is no longer home, right? You're flying and you have a different environment. It's the same for human beings. So this is why transformation is difficult, because that change can be scary, right? So everyone who's talking about change, when do you want it? Now. Are we going to get it? Yes. How are we going to get it? And nobody knows, right? What do you want? Change. And everybody wants to chant. But nobody actually wants to change because we don't know what will become on the other side. And I want to reassure you that if you embark on this process, you'll become better, but it won't be necessarily easy, because that change that starts with you means that you have to deal with you. I say to a lot of young people who still play video games like I do, that in a lot of these fighting games, the character that you have to face before you beat the game is yourself, right? Because that's always going to be the hardest thing that you have to do as you grow, is face yourself. And a lot of the isolation and loneliness that COVID has brought on is because we're not able to connect and commune with people in traditional ways. But I see it as an opportunity to connect and commune with yourself. And that's also why people are afraid and lonely, right? Because we've not been socialized to do that work. So being in a culture that does not necessarily want you to change also, to me, suggests that society understands how dangerous that is, because if we change as individuals, society will change, because we create society. We create these systems, right? So if we want a different society post-COVID, then we have to do our work now to change. That I have here, pre-COVID, like the way I even went through this process. I started reading a lot of books as a kid, and I kind of was the nerd, right? I would sit in the front of the bus and people would be throwing paper and spit wads at me because I'd be reading when everybody else was back in the back being cool. And so the guys I was growing up with, we started to drift apart because I was changing, right? And then I started to go to different bookstores. Instead of going to, the main bookstore that had the cool nonfiction books, I started going to places like Alkebulan on the east side that had books about African history, about great African Americans. And I started to meet different people who had similar interests because they were in the same place, right? And you only went to that place for the knowledge that you were seeking. And then that started a different type of conversation. And then, instead of going to clubs where I could dance and hang out, I just wasn't interested in that because I was in a different place. I went to places like Snaps and Taps, where I met my wife and I met some great friends who are still on this path, and we've supported each other on that path. If I hadn't started that early, I would never have met Ruth. I would never have met people like Scott Woods. I would never have met the Willoughbys and folks who, artistically are thinking differently, are doing significant work, right? So that's an example for me how even early on, a lot of things shifted because I began to figure out who I was. I began that process of growth and becoming. And as a result, my social circles changed. My engagement with information shifted, right? My not just social circle and information, but the way I processed information. I got in a lot of trouble in high school and college because I was reading things that people my age probably weren't supposed to read by the perspective of the teachers and professors, but I had different information, which means I had a different level of conversation, right? And that's what happens. And it was rough. A lot of times I felt isolated and ostracized because I hadn't yet found my people. And then I began to meet musicians like Eddie Bayard and Dean Hewlett and Will Minifield and so many others who became my people. And even along that path, I met folks who weren't friends, they were mentors. Steve Paco Greer would let me hang out and just pull records out of his collection and put it on. Like, I learned how to treat an album the right way and not break it, right? Because he would have been really mad if I broke some of these. But he told me about who the musicians were. He told me about the context in which they made the music. He told me about the social political context in which they made the music, which gave the music its foundation, why it was important. There were no 14, 15, 16-year-olds that had that kind of information, right? So I spent a lot of time with, at that time, a 50-year-old, who's teaching me about the history of this art form that I now am a practitioner of, right? And so you meet guides along the way. You meet companions along the way. You meet partners. Ruth is my lifelong partner, and she's been on this journey with me for 21, almost 22 years, right? So yes, it can be a fearful act to embark on this process of becoming, because you literally tear away the old you, right? Just like that caterpillar that sheds its husk, so to speak, right? And reforms itself and goes from, legs that crawl on the ground to wings that fly in the air, right? We have to become and do the same. Now, it takes about 14 days or so for a caterpillar to shift. And that's because everything in the universe has laid the groundwork for that caterpillar to become a butterfly. The only thing that really gets in its way is us when we step on them and bother them, right? The difference between a caterpillar and a human being is that we live in societies that don't want us to change, because it will shift society. So that's why it's difficult. That's why it's a radical act to not only do your heart work, but to then act on that work of becoming in such a way that builds new community, that then leverages that community to shift the culture. And that's really what we're talking about in the politics of humanity. Yes?
Question, how does one start that process?
How does one start that process? I'm glad you asked that. So, the way you start that process, I had to look at my notes because I wrote it down. Just had to skip to it, but since the question was asked, we'll go there. The way you start that process is really what we talked about last week, right? So I'll kind of reiterate that. The first thing you do is you have to take time to be quiet and sit with yourself, right? I got to a point as a musician where at an early age, being the precocious musician I was, church music was boring to me, and I had to figure out what else there was in the world. And so I sat down behind the drums and I would play things, and the music for me was the tool that opened doors to new ideas, right? I heard myself playing a certain way, and I would just ask questions, and folks who were older, more mature than I, as musicians, would point me in a direction. That's how I met James Elliott. We call him Smooth, right? Smooth was a drummer who played with Jimmy Smith and all these famous musicians, Rusty Bryant out in LA and in Ohio. And he heard me playing in church, and he heard evidence of what I was kind of working out. And he said, I think you have some skills. And he convinced my mom at 12 years old to take me to a jazz club on Saturday morning. And the thing was called Jazz Next, incidentally, at a place that now a good friend of mine, Jason Williams, his family owned that restaurant. And we didn't know each other then, and now we make those connections, right? So he took me to Jazz Next. I met Gene Walker, I met Hank Marr, I met all these musicians who had played with the Beatles, who had played with Charlie Parker. And they heard me play, and I wasn't great, right? In fact, the first time I sat down at the drums, Billy Brown, who was the drummer, he literally, in the middle of the song, tapped my shoulder and got me off the drums and made me stand right next to him and watch. The point was, I took the time to begin the process. Right? And by taking the time to begin the process and even ask the question, what else is there? What am I missing? Who am I? What do I really want? And then really going through the process of thinking through. And when you can't find the answers yourself, there's a thing called the law of attraction. And what I think happened was I attracted people into my life that became mentors, right? Because thoughts are vibrations. Vibrations are energy, and energy is what and how we connect. That's what spirit is, right? So as you begin the process, what are you interested in? What in your heart of hearts, what would you like to be? Who would you like to be? What would you like to do? Those are questions. I made lists. I always make lists. People who know me know I make lists. And I knew that at 12 years old, I wanted to be a famous musician. I knew that I wanted my music to have an impact on people. And I use music because that's the way I kind of connected with the world at an early age. But it could be anything. Are you wanting to be a poet, a writer? Do you want to work in finance? Do you want to be a teacher? Any of those things, if you're in community, your community can connect you to resources. If you want to be a teacher, do you know any teachers? Hit them up via email and ask them what that process is like, right? It's not always about vocation, right? But a lot of times on the path to a vocation, we begin to uncover things inside of us that help us understand, what our path and what our purpose is. And that's really what it comes down to. Path and purpose is not always about profession, right? Vocation is more what your spiritual purpose is, what value you add to the world. That's why at the point where we're practicing politics of humanity, the real goal is about adding value as opposed to extracting value, right? If you don't yet know what your interests are, that's the work. That's the initial step, right? Who are you really? And if you don't know, that's not a bad thing, right? This is exactly the time to figure that out, right? What do you care about? Who do you love and why do you love? Do you love yourself? If not, why not? What happened in your experience that has made you dislike yourself, right? And that's the part that's really, really hard. Facing yourself for who you are, whether you like yourself or not, and wrestling with whatever happened in your life that made you look at yourself differently and not even trust yourself. In my TED Talk, I talk about the transformative power of trust, and there are 3 forms of trust, in my opinion. One is self-trust. That's the hardest thing to do because, again, we're socialized not to trust ourselves, especially if you're a person of color, right? Authority figures have never been you in American history, and even when you look at folks like Barack Obama, that's a great image, right? But that was 8 years out of, 1776 until now, right? I mean, that's a blip on the radar, right? And in our media, I was at the grocery store the other day and I looked at the magazines, and of the 30 magazines, because I counted each one of them, there were only 2 people of color on the covers. So I didn't see myself in an equitable context. So to me, authority, fame, all that kind of stuff, if I was a more impressionable mind, does not look like me, right? So it's not any of our fault necessarily that we might not like each other or see ourselves in these positions of power and influence and the ability to contribute positively to community, right? It's not even being black or a person of color. If you're born poor, we have a class-based society that also tells you you have no value, right? So the first thing is to spend time with yourself and start the process of loving yourself. List the things that you love about yourself, like about yourself, hate about yourself, and then work through that list backwards, right? Why do I hate or not like this about myself? What happened? Where did that come from? Earlier in the summer, we talked about the 4 Agreements book by Miguel Ruiz. And in that book, he argues that there is a lot about who we are that we never chose, right? Not only did we not choose it, we don't know why it's there in the first place. And so there are a lot of our behaviors that are governed by beliefs that we had no part in creating, crafting, choosing, right? So this first part of becoming is doing that heart work instead of hard work of understanding truly who we are and wrestling with the issues of self, right? And again, I can tell you from experience, taking that first step is the hardest step. But once you take it and you commit to the path, The universe puts things in your way. Like right now, it's really funny because we just watched the Social Dilemma. Right, it's this fantastic documentary about social media. It talks about how social media is really a manipulation tool to get us to buy more or make different choices and all these things. While maybe it wasn't initially set up to be that way, the monetary structure behind social media definitely brings that manipulation to bear in the most subtle of ways. But I will say this. Because I have been on this path of growth and becoming and trying to be better every day, not always successfully, there have been times where I felt like the ancestors were speaking to me on social media, right? I might wake up with a thought and I open up Facebook and there's something that speaks right to that thing, right? How is that? It might be because I started this path before social media, and so the things that I follow align with how I'm moving in the world or trying to move in the world, right? But it's not even about just messaging. I know that there have been times where my wife, Ruth, or I, or other people I know have shared stories where they were thinking about a family member, and the first thing in their timeline is, a picture of that person. They might have passed away, right? But that picture just kind of let them know that they were connecting spiritually to this energy that loved them and they loved, right? And, there's no algorithm for that. But that lets you know that there are other things at work, other energies at work. And by doing the work of becoming, we can tap into those energies, and that then connects us to other people, and we create community around this path forward. And that path forward, again, is not an extraction of resources. It's about value add, right? What happens when we build community focused on humanity, right? Targeted universalism, as an example. The politics of humanity practices targeted universalism, which says everybody has needs, and we are going to leverage our collective resources to ensure everyone has what they need. Right? So we don't have to have an either or. It's not I get to pay my rent and you don't. You get to eat and I don't. Or my racism issue is more important than your sexism issue or your classism issue or your anti-Semitism issue. It's not even about the trauma awards or the trauma games, right? To see whose trauma is more important or harsher or what have you. It's recognizing that we are all human beings. We all love and we all have experienced loss, and that's all important. It's all important. If you have been wronged as a human being, I have been wronged as a human being. Dr. Amos Wilson said, because I am human, then if a human life is lost, a part of my life has been lost, right? That's the level that we have to see each other, right? We have to see ourselves in each other. And you cannot see yourself in someone else until you first see yourself. So that's the work. So the first step is taking that time, making that list, and beginning to work through those issues until you love yourself so much that you can't help but to love everyone else. And one great book to help, again, it's an easy read, is The 4 Agreements by Miguel Ruiz, only because it's an easy read. He has 4 principles: be impeccable with your word, always do your best, don't take things personally, and I can't remember the last one. But then he has stories that back all of those things up that really help you begin the process of thinking through how to become a better you, right? And if you're not a reader, that's fine. There are other resources. And like I said, by the end of the month, I'll have a page up on marklomaxii.com that'll have a bunch of that stuff. And so before Christmas, you'll be able to find that stuff and start in the new year with some video resources, some book resources that'll help. But that's really the first step, right? The second step, because of that path and that process, is what happens when, you begin to resonate, vibrate differently. Right? This is literally a process of changing the vibration, changing consciousness, which is why things change, literally. Not just things, but people around you, the things you do, the things that are important, and how you respond to various stimuli, right? Here's an example: slavery. There's there's a sense that when our people were enslaved, that meant every part of them was bound. Every aspect of who they were as human beings was bound. That's not true. If that was true, I don't really think that anybody who's identifying as African American that has slavery in their lineage would be here today, because if we were completely and totally bound, we would have died. But there's this other sense in an African-centered perspective that you might be able to bound my body, but you cannot bound my spirit, you cannot bind my mind, right? And so there's a freedom even in bondage because we know who we are. We knew who we were, and we knew why we were. Now, one could argue that we've forgotten that in the 400 years that we've been in this continent, in this environment. But back then, we were still connected to the traditions and identities that came across the Atlantic with us as we were stolen from Africa, right? And so that notion of identity, that's the becoming part, is super important. And once you have that, once you've done that work, you know, you've shifted your consciousness into a knowledge of self that now means you're resonating differently, and you then attract different people, different information, different values, different ideas to you because you're now moving up this level. A friend of ours uses the symbol of a spiral, and I never understood why she did that. And then in the book about the Bantu Congo, the cosmology of the Bantu Congo, he has this notion of a spiral also. And the spiral represents, I would show you a picture, but I don't think this will come up really well on camera. The spiral represents the path, right? So if this is your horizon right here, and you begin here, and you begin to spiral out, that's how you're growing, right? And so you always come back to that linear path, right? But you never come back in the same place. That's because when you grow, you change, but you're still existing in the world as a person in space and time. But your consciousness is always elevating, different, changing, vibrating differently, which means you're attracting different people, different things to you, different information to help you get to the next step, right? And that's why community is so important, because we cannot do this on our own, right? I could be maybe one day the most evolved human being ever, but if I don't work in community, that's only going to benefit me, which means it benefits nobody, right? Going back to the slavery notion, if I escaped from slavery, but my family didn't, my life isn't necessarily better because I'm constantly worried. I cannot move forward because I'm connected, still tethered to that trauma. So then I go back, Harriet Tubman, and start to free more folks because I realize that I cannot be free unless others are free, right? That's why the way capitalism works doesn't work for everyone. Because if I get rich and you don't, now I'm worried that you're going to come and attack me for my resources because now there's a barrier between us, right? Because I've extracted so many resources. We used Thomas Jefferson's quote about how he fears for his country because God's justice is true. And if the enslaved people would wake up and realize that they outnumbered folks on the plantation very easily, they could overpower folks, right? It's because they were extracting resources and literally extracting bodies. And they knew it was unjust. He knew it was unjust. And so how do we do this in a just and equitable way? It means that we are focused on what's best for all of us. So my freedom is contingent upon your freedom, right? That's the principle of Ubuntu. I am because you are, and because you are, I am, right? So you begin that process of becoming an individual, and the more work you do as an individual, quote unquote individual, the more you realize that you are a part of a community. Because the deeper we go into ourselves, the more we see each other, the rest of us, right? Once that happens, you begin to attract people, right? And that's the second part of trust, the community of trust, right? One of my favorite movies, because I think it's hilarious, is Meet the Fockers, and De Niro's character is like, are you in my circle of trust? Are we okay, right? And while that's a comedic kind of example, it really is a manifestation visually of what it means to begin to grow in community together, right? we're socialized not to trust each other because we've been socialized to be capitalists, right? Consumers, material. So if I value myself based on what I have, if you don't have what I have, again, then I'm fearful that you might try to take it away. And if I don't have what you have, then I feel less about myself than you because I don't have what you have. That's crap. It ain't nothing, it got nothing to do with that, really, right? It's really about who we are as human beings, right? And when you are in community where folks are valuing each other based on their humanity, then things happen differently, right? There's no fear of anyone trying to extract resources because we realize that the resources are here for all of us and that there's enough for all of us if we create policy, procedure, practice, culture that ensures that we all have what we need, right? That's the shift. And that will completely rework, reprogram how our social structure works in America, right? And that's the third level of trust, activating that trust. Once you trust and love yourself and then begin to engage in community that you can become a part of and trust and love and grow and learn, right? The second ritual, education, then you have now a group of people and information to undergird the work that you need to do to create the transformation in your community, right? And once you've activated that trust, activated that community, activated that love, you know, you're writing letters, you're running for office, you're, you know, supporting each other in their businesses, you're really now doing what democracy is, right? Democracy is something that we do. It is not something that happens to us. Community is something that we do. It is not something that happens to us. Becoming is something that we do. It is not something that happens to us, right? But we all have to be accountable for our own growth because that is the value add to the whole, right? As a musician, if I haven't practiced my part, but the band has, then the band won't sound good because I don't sound good. If I've practiced but the band hasn't, any number of them, then we won't sound good no matter how well I play, right? Playing basketball, I can score 70 points and still lose because nobody else on the team scored anything and the opposing team scored 100, right? So that means we're all accountable. It's like a wheel, right? If each of us do our work, then when it's our turn to hit the ground, we can push the car forward, right? Many hands make light work. So the first step is engaging yourself in learning who you are, who you want to be, how you want to become, who you want to become, and the how is getting that information, right? From a mentor, from a book, several books, from, you know, videos that help you dig deeper into who you are and understand, you know, the causal factors of the traumas that put you in a position maybe where you don't like yourself. And you work through that pain to become stronger, right? The second thing is, as you're on that path, you begin to meet people in many ways, safe ways. If you're in public with a mask, safe ways. Virtually, you can connect with people all over the world who are on this path, right? And then you begin to grow together in community, right? You develop that community of trust. And then, this is why community is important. Once you have that level of engagement, you activate that community to do something together that turns things around, right? It wasn't Martin Luther King on his own that got the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act done. Not at all. Martin Luther King worked in community, right? He galvanized folks with beautiful words, eloquent speeches, right? But there were already groups of people on the ground who were organizing, bringing people together to do the work because they had a similar shared experience and a plan of action, a community of trust. And then the SDLC came in and put the icing on the cake and led things forward. That's what happens when you activate community, right? Hang on. All right. So I'm going to play something else, and then we're going to close this out. I didn't realize I was talking that much. So it's important to do the work of becoming, embark on that path, right? And as you do that, you gain new community because you become different, which means you need people who match and align and resonate with who you are becoming, right? They help you on the path, they guide you, they walk with you. But once you're in that new communal space, you have more agency because the folks who are thinking like you and on a similar path, even if you don't see things exactly the same, right? That means you now can leverage that to create something new in your community. Trusting, loving, becoming yourself, taking that new self into a space and being open to new community, activating that trust, love in that community to transform the world around you, right? It seems counterintuitive, right? It seems counterintuitive because we've been taught so much that, you know, things just are the way they are. Poverty, you know, it's always been here, so we can't change it. Well, that's not true. It's not always been here. It's not always been here, right? The only reason I think that we have poverty in America is because it's a core value. Some people have to lose. But if we get to the point where we don't believe that to be true, then we can change that. Because the system of capitalism is a system that was set up by people, which means it can be dismantled or changed or in some way reshaped, right? Or we can completely tear it down and create a new system that ensures that there are no poor people in our country. As just one example, right? Homelessness. Why is it that we think it's okay that some people don't have safe and decent shelter? Why is it that we turn blind eyes to people who need us the most? Because it's a core value, right? Again, that ain't my problem. Why don't they just get up and go to work? I filled out an application, why can't they? Well, we don't ever know what's going on with people, but the more we become ourselves, truly our optimal human manifestation, expression, the more we begin to see folks for who they are and not how they present, right? That's seeing ourselves in each other. And when we can see ourselves in each other and we really believe what we see because we've become that new person, then we begin to know and see how we can make a difference and change. And you're right. Folks who say, well, I can't do anything about the system. No, maybe one person can't do anything about the system, right? But as Kwame Ture said, organize, 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 right? Get into groups of like-minded people. Now, here's the difference. Here's the caveat, right? Because a counter argument could be, well, 73 million people, like-minded folks, voted for 45. Isn't that a transformative action? It absolutely is a transformative action. If he had won, and it was a transformative action when he won the first time, right? There are a lot of things about this country that suck, in my opinion, as a result of this current administration, right? That's an example. Any administration is an example of how people can get together and change things, right? The difference, though, is that I'm talking about engaging in community for the benefit of community, right? The core values are different when we practice a politics of humanity because it puts human beings first in balance with nature and the cosmos. Balance, right? That's the key difference, right? There are people right now, we're not going to change the world immediately. There are people right now who think that what I'm talking about is crazy, right? What do you mean a politics of humanity? Politics are politics. The economy is the economy, right? This is this and that is that, and we can't change it because that's how it's always been. To me, that's deficit thinking. That's deficit thinking. As an artist, if I thought that all the music that was written was all the music that could be written, I would never write more music. Right? I mean, that just to me is antithetical to how human beings have existed on the planet for the millions of years that we have. Right? We have always evolved. Whether you agree with it or not, there's even this kind of evolutionary chart that shows literally how we've changed over the years. We're taller now than we were 50 years ago, right? We live longer now than we did 100 years ago. Things are always changing. Life is change, right? As Octavia Butler said in Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents, God is change, right? And she's dealing with ancient wisdom that talks about the power of change in the human experience and how it allows us to create new and better things, new and better ways of being, right? But we cannot do it individually. Again, if I think that I'm free, but nobody else around me is free, I'm actually bound. I cannot be free unless others are free. I cannot be truly free unless everyone is truly free, right? This is the cultural value that we have to get to, that we are because we are, right? We are because we are. We are human because we chose to be human, right? And so in the context of America, the American dream is just that, an illusion of power, right, of a state of being. We have the freedom of choice in many respects, who to vote for, where to shop, but we have no real power because we've not gotten to that point where we made the choice to become, right? So the choice is whether or not to be human in spite of the constant physical and psychological attacks against us because we live in this oppressive system. And that, yes, absolutely applies to a racialized context, but it also is beyond that racialized context. Right? Because of how capitalism works, because of how our politics have worked to only really benefit those folks at the top of the economic food chain. We can change that. I don't have anything against wealth. I don't have anything, honestly, against anybody. Right? I don't have to like your choices, but I respect you as a human being, whomever you are. I'm just advocating for those who are not satisfied with the status quo because they recognize that it's not working for everyone, that we be about the work of ensuring that our society works for everyone in this country. And by extension, we will shift the way the world operates because of the position America has in the world. I mean, it's really amazing the opportunity we have as Americans. I mean, like it or not, we spend more money on our military than anyone else. Like it or not, we have, if not because I know there has been some shifts recently with the virus, but we have the number one, number two economy in the world. We generate about $20 trillion. We have a very crazy military. It's all over the world. We talked about that earlier. What happens if the human beings in that military, the human beings who command that military, the human beings that control the resources of a $20 trillion economy are focused on what's best for humanity, are focused on what's best for the planet by extension, and are guided by the universal principle of love? As an example, right? What King called the physical power of love, trans-psychic power of love, right? This thing that transcends human beings because it manifests in policy, it manifests in our action, it manifests in our engagement with each other. So while the choice is whether or not to be human, we're preparing for a new year, and I think the choice is whether or not right now we do the heart work of embarking on the path to our full human potential that brings then about a new sense of community and the ability and wherewithal to cultivate and practice a politics of humanity that over generations, we begin to see a difference. We see a difference in how our grandchildren engage the world. We see a difference in how our children, lead the world. We see a difference in how our planet heals because we are now operating in balance, right? So will you choose as we go into this next year to become fully human, or will you keep dreaming? I'm going to play us out. Y'all have a great weekend. Y'all have a great weekend. We'll see you next week for the last episode of Drumversations for 2020. Have a great weekend. Peace.